Thank you, Simone. Uh, this is a presentation on the 7 deadly sins of small business. It was adapted from Fortune Small Business article in June of 2009, but it's been embellished by the many years of experience that Richard and I bring to this and the rest of ASAP. So we will jump right in. The 7 deadly sins are sloppy accounting, unrealistic pricing, naive hiring, fear of firing, lack of standards, lack of controls, and poor branding. And we'll go into each one of these in more detail, starting with sloppy accounting. Keith Cunningham, who is an independent business consultant, very successful entrepreneur in his own right, has written a book called The Keys to the Vault. And in that he says, if you don't understand your financials, you should not be in the game of business. Accounting is a diagnostic tool to tell you what's going on, both what's going right and what's going wrong with your company. But it depends on having the right information. If you put garbage in, you get garbage out. And it doesn't matter which fancy program or bookkeeper you use, if it's not done correctly, you're not getting the right information. So not only do you need the correct information, but you need the right talent. You need the right person to be doing your accounting for you. In the small business world, many people turn to Susie, the bookkeeper down the street, or their sister Sally, who used to do bookkeeping back in high school, and they're just not up to date and don't know what they're doing. Some of the most basic financial reports don't come out correctly if the data isn't entered properly. And one of the telltale signs is looking at a balance sheet, and it, by definition, has to be in balance, but we see far too many that aren't just because people didn't know what they were doing.
And yeah, just to footnote what Todd said, another way of saying what Keith Cunningham said is that you can't very well play the game of business if you don't know how to keep score. So regardless of what business you're in, what size of business, you got to know what the scorecard says. In the financial world, the accounting is the scorecard.
Yeah. And understanding the ratio of your sales to expenses is critical. You need to know what that is in order to be profitable. And too many people think if sales are going up, boy, the world is great. But if expenses are going up faster than sales, then you can have a real message. A real problem, sorry. One of the things that we at ASAP constantly try to get our people and our clients to do is look at their results. You need to look at them not just as snapshots, but looking at them over time. And the next slide that we'll pull up is a business that we deal with, and we have taken their results and graphed them over time. So this is a 2-year look at a business. It's in a resort community here in Colorado. So you can see the green line or the green ribbon goes up and down with the seasons, which is to be expected in a resort economy. And from the beginning of this until the end of it, you can see that the green line, while it goes up and down, it's generally trending upward. So they were thinking, gee, my business is great. Every time I look at it, it's better than I thought it would be or better than the year before. The blue line is their cost of goods sold, the cost of the supplies and the materials and everything else that goes into that business. And while it goes up and down slightly with the seasons, it's not going up or down across the whole graph. But the yellow line, which is their total expense line, and this included their personnel cost and their rent and everything else, you can see over this period, while it's irregular as well, from the left to the right, it's going up. And as a result, the red line, which is their net income, is continually headed in a downward direction. It started off just barely above zero, but by the time we're at 2 years out, they're almost $20,000 in the hole. They don't understand this. They don't get a picture of this if they're not looking at it over a long period of time. So constantly review those results. Look over time, not just the snapshot, and watch cash flow. Cash flow is critical. You can be in business for a long time without being profitable. And in this day and age, Google is maybe the best example I can think of in that category. They were not profitable for at least 10 years, but they never ran out of cash. You can be unprofitable as long as there are cash reserves. But the day you're out of cash, the doors close.
Yeah, and Todd, if I can give two more examples that I think the people can relate to. General Motors ran out of cash, and they had to declare bankruptcy and go to the government to be bailed out. Meanwhile, Ford Motor Company, who was faced with the same economic conditions that General Motors was faced with, had gone to the debt markets, borrowed quite a bit of money when the borrowing was good, so they had plenty of cash reserves. Therefore, they did not have to go through bankruptcy, even though they were confronted with the same economic calamities that General Motors was faced with. And as a result, coming on the backside, I guess you've all noticed that Ford is much more respected in the marketplace, and it's really helped their market situation by their increased market share in the last couple of years.
And I'll actually also jump in as well, too. We had a question come in from Steve, and he's wondering, where would you find a good template for a budget for a small professional service business?
Todd, you want to take that one? Or a professional service business is a business where you're selling time. Time is your product. And so, therefore, your major expense line items are your personnel costs. And your personnel cost is a relationship to what those personnel are generating in the way of revenues for the entity. And Steve, as a snapshot or a thumbnail point of reference, I would say that your personnel cost in a professional service business should be in the neighborhood of 36% of your revenues or less. And that represents not only what you pay your people, but your payroll taxes, your health insurance cost, any other benefits you provide to your employees. Your total cost of your personnel should be in the neighborhood of 36% of your total revenues. Now that's not providing you with a budget, but that's providing you with kind of a benchmark that a professional service business should be doing on an annualized basis. Their personnel cost, which is their major line item, should never exceed more than about 36% of their total business. I hope that helps. Now, on the other side, as far as the fixed expenses, rent, heat, light, power, office supplies, those are the other items that you certainly wanted to track as well. Professional service business today also spend a lot of money on software to deliver their products. So that's another large expense item that most professional service businesses have to invest in today's environment. Any other thoughts, Todd?
Well, not particularly for this, but let's talk about budgets because that gives a point of comparison. And a budget is correct at only one point, and that's when you create it. It's your best idea or your best guess as what's going to happen in the coming year or the coming periods, and the real world doesn't ever conform to what those guesses are. So we use a budget as a reference tool to say, how are things going compared to what we thought they would? And let's talk about what the attendees here. How do you budget? Do you do a budget? Do you not do a budget? We've got some choices here that we put in. Yeah, I do a budget, but it's in my head, or I write it down, but I don't review it. Or, yes, I absolutely do and refer to it regularly. Or, gee, I don't think my company's big enough. Well, what's a budget? Well, we're going to do a little poll here. We've got the opportunity to pick one of these. So we've got 6 responses coming in already out of the dozen or so people that we've got on here. So we'll give you another 30 seconds or so to make a choice, and then we'll see what the attendees of this webinar.
Be honest with yourself as well as us. Your name won't be associated with your response. So tell it like it is, guys.
All right, I'm going to close the poll, and then we'll get to look at the results. So, more than 2/3 of us do a budget, and we refer to it regularly. We've got a couple of attendees who do a budget, but it's in their head, and that makes it a little more complicated than somebody who writes it down and doesn't review it. So what I'd like to highlight here is, as part of we're avoiding sloppy accounting, is we have to make adjustments. And we make adjustments to how we run the business based on what's actually happening. Do we adjust the budget? No. It was a guess, and it's always going to be incorrect. But it's a point of reference, and only if there's some huge outstanding change in the way the business is going, we wouldn't re-budget during the year. Now, a couple of years ago, when the bottom fell out of the economy, a lot of people were forced to adjust, and adjust rather significantly. But that doesn't mean you remake a budget in the middle of the year, but you do have to make adjustments. So those are kind of some of the basic watch outs in the accounting side of things. Pricing is the next to the 7 deadly sins, and unfortunately many small businesses don't understand pricing. The first thing you absolutely must do is understand what your cost of goods sold is. What does it cost you to deliver the product or service? And I say simply in quotations because it's really not simple, but it's the cost of acquiring your products or services less what it costs you to sell them. And that's what gives you the cost of goods. Scrap, freight, damages, theft, obsolescence, these are all components of the cost of goods. And when you're carrying inventory, and if it's been in your warehouse for 3 years and there's little chance of selling it, then you really need to recognize that that's part of the cost of goods. Cost of sales is also important to recognize, and as Richard was talking about for professional services business, wages and fringe benefits and all the components of that are a big part of that cost of sales, as are any discounts that you're giving to your customers. And we live in a world of discounting, so we need to recognize that in our pricing. What your competition is doing is also very important. You can't be the highest priced provider of a commodity and expect to sell much of it. So you need to have a good idea of what your competitors are doing, both locally and beyond. And I say beyond because in today's market, the internet is a huge source of information and of actual commerce for many, many small businesses. So you can't just look at your own local community, but you have to look at what your customers are able to access in terms of pricing.
And Todd, let me jump in here if you don't mind. I want to give an example because all of the things we just talked about, understanding the cost of providing the product is extremely important. But you also need to understand the perception that the market has for your product.
Right, and that's coming up in another slide here, just in a minute.
Yeah, sorry, got ahead of us there.
Jump into that, but we've got another little poll in here. How do you currently price your product or services? Do you do it on cost plus, or do you match your competition, or based on how much time you spend? In a professional services business, that's often the way people bill, whether it's attorneys or CPAs, they base on time, or is it whatever the boss thinks the price should be, or something else? So here's another chance to give your opinion on how you currently price your products or your services. Give it another couple of seconds here for people to vote. And I'm going to close the poll now. What we see is we've got a lot of different ways of pricing. Even this relatively small number of people listening to this webinar, it's kind of all over the map. So we want to move into understanding your customers. And Richard will give you a chance to jump in here with this one in a second. One of the people that helped me through my career was Dr. Jeff Luftig. He's an endowed professor in the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado now. And he's a very funny guy. And his laws of economics are very simple. His first law is customers are our friends. Second law is customers have money. Third law, we want it. Fourth law, customers aren't going to give us their money unless we give them what they're looking for. So the price and the expectation of the customer is what really should determine how you price your products and services. The best price is what the customer perceives the value to be, not how much it costs you, not necessarily what anybody else is charging, but what the customer perceives the value of what you're doing. And Richard, you got a couple of examples here?
Yeah, the example we like to use most is a study we did on a hammer manufacturing company. And this hammer manufacturing company had designed a new hammer that used new technology and they brought it into the marketplace, and they presented the hammer for sale in 1995. And the hammer went into hardware stores and Home Depot stores, and it just laid a big egg. They couldn't sell any hammers in 1995, and they couldn't understand why. So they started doing some studies of people that bought hammers, and they did focus groups, and they found out that there's really two markets for hammers. There's the professional carpenter that needs a real fine hammer, and that's his tool of his trade. And then you've got the home user that kind of works on the weekends and uses a hammer about every 3 months at best. And they found that the home weekend warrior that used a hammer thought 1995 was way too expensive for a hammer to just be thrown in a toolbox and used occasionally. Correspondingly, they found that 1995 was way too cheap a price for the professional carpenter that used that hammer every day in his trade or business. So as a result, they went back and took the same hammer and brought it out at two different price levels. They brought one out at $9.95, and they brought the other hammer out at $39.95 and packaged it differently and sold that through the hardware stores and where the dealerships that specialize in catering to professional carpenters, and all of a sudden the hammers started jumping off the shelves. So that tells you a lot there. It's the perceived value is the most important thing, regardless of what your cost is in a particular product. That doesn't really matter. You need to know what your cost is, don't get me wrong, but you also need to know what does the marketplace perceive the value of my product, and what are they willing to pay for it.
And in that example that Richard just described, these hammers were priced at $9.95, $39.95, and that's for a reason. We're all human, and we perceive that an even number, anything slightly less than that, is a better deal. And here I've said $299 versus $300. We'll take the $299, even though it's only a $1 difference. But in many studies that have been done of consumer response to pricing, find that just taking a penny off or just taking $1 off has a huge impact on the volume sold. The next point is uniqueness is pricing power. And if you can make your product or your service truly unique, you can price whatever the consumer will value at, and you don't have to worry about competition. Marketing is a tool that everybody uses to try to explain how unique you are, but really being unique gives you the power to price much higher. And the last element here on this pricing page is the 80-20 rule. And it's true in pricing as well as everything else in life. And the example that Richard described of the hammer customers fits this exactly. When they went into the Home Depot kind of store, they found that 80% of the customers were looking for an inexpensive hammer. When they went into the hardware and the contractor supply stores, 80% of the customers in those stores were looking for something that they could consider as a professional tool. So using that 80%, rather than trying to figure out what every last person wants, they were able to set pricing for the greatest majority of customers in those store types. When we were giving this seminar in another location, we had a banker say, well, in my business, it's even worse than that. He said, we get 100% of our revenue, or of our profit, from 5% of our clients. So they have to do a lot of things to get the other 95% of those clients in the bank, but by having them, they're able to attract the 5% that bring them all the profitable business. So pay attention to that 80% and where those revenues come from, and particularly what they perceive as the value. We'll move on to hiring next. People have a hard time in small businesses with hiring because they tend to look at the person or the applicants rather than what they need to fill the job. And the first order of business is always to identify what you need. Consider what you're doing for your customers and how that helps define the needs of the position that you're hiring. Advertise widely, and very specifically for the position you're hiring for. In this day and age and in this economy, you will find that there are many, many people looking for work who you would not have normally considered. Our business just recently put an ad in numerous publications, went on Craigslist and used the internet as well, and we are getting resumes from all over the country for a job in Colorado because people are available. So it's a much better buyer's market for labor than it ever used to be. And then once you've got candidates, evaluate them against the criteria that you built in that first step. Your process of hiring needs to be built around how you can figure out if that person will thrive in the position and thrive in your company's culture. And they have to be a fit for you. A good way to do that is job simulation. Give the candidate a challenge that's related to the things that you do in your job every day and see how they handle it. If they're going to be in a customer service job, put them on the phone, listen to them. You can't do that with hundreds of candidates, but after you've brought it down to a handful, job simulation is a good way to identify whether or not the candidates will fit the job requirements and your company's culture. And there are many tools in the marketplace to understand who it is you're hiring. Background screening, reference checks. With our company, and we offer this as a service to our clients, we do screening, drug screens are available, background checks, and they're very low cost compared to what it would cost you to hire the wrong person. And if you're doing reference checks, many companies will say, well, all we will do is confirm that an individual worked for us for a certain time period and their pay scale was X, Y, or Z. But if you can get a reference from their previous supervisor and can call them up or email them and say, if so-and-so is such a great person, why aren't they working for you now? It doesn't necessarily get you a clean answer, but it's much more likely to give you an insight into why they left that previous position that they think this person thinks so highly of them. And a lot of times it's family issues and things like that, but if they're hesitant to answer, then you've got a clue that maybe something isn't as right as you think it is.
And another thing, if I could jump in here, Todd, in many instances, we have got situations where people are hiring people and not doing background checks on child abuse situations, and they're putting them in environments and school settings that is just rife with potential for litigation. And any attorney, that's the first thing they will tell you about hiring is you should have known. And if you hire somebody with a DWI background, which is a public record, and you put them behind the wheel of a vehicle with kids in it, you should have known. So these are things that a lot of people just don't take the time to do background screenings on, and they're opening themselves to tremendous liability situations if something should go wrong. So you definitely should know as much about your employee that you're hiring and what position you're putting them in before you put them into that position that could really cause you a lot of liability issues.
Well, and even before liability issues, we have a contractor that we've worked with who hired an individual without doing a background check, like Richard suggested, and had them drive a company vehicle. Turned out that this individual had numerous moving violations, and in the first week that they were on the job, they were involved in an accident. Didn't hurt anybody, but destroyed a truck. And again, having done that background check, they would have had a clue that this might not be the best person for the job. Now, the flip side to naive hiring is fear of firing. And as Richard says all the time, hire slowly, fire quickly. Getting rid of someone is never pleasant, but it's sometimes necessary. The damage that is done by a bad employee goes much, much deeper than you can imagine. It's not just the fact that you're having difficulties dealing with them, but your customers, your clientele who interact with that person are turned off from your business, and the rest of your employees see that as a sign of your management skill and question what's going on. So a good temperature measurement, if you will, is would you be relieved if someone quit? If so, you've got a problem.
Yeah, and the other way I like to say it, Todd, is the first time you ought to think about firing somebody is the first time you think about it. If it enters your mind, there's probably a good reason, and that's the time to step in and do something about it. So first time you think about firing somebody, do it.
Now, the fifth deadly sin out of the seven is lack of standards. This is a critical job of management to set standards. Set standards for your public image, for your customer service, for the quality of the goods and the services that you do. If you don't set them, who will? Your employees, and where are they getting the information or the vision to do that? Now, that's management's job. And then you have to create working measurements you can use every day. Just as Richard said back in the financial sloppy accounting section, if you don't know what your financial results are, if you can't measure it, you don't know where you're going. Well, the same thing with all of these other standards. If you can't measure them, you can't tell how you're doing. And then from lack of standards, the sixth deadly sin is lack of control. If you don't have standards and you don't have measurements, then how do you control it? Use those measurements. What do they tell you? Do you need more training? Do processes need to be simplified? Do they need to be made goof-proof to the extent possible? People make mistakes, but if they're using procedures, using checklists, it's much easier to make sure that things are done right. Do they need better materials? Or do you have a product quality issue because you didn't buy a good enough grade of raw material? These are all what the results can tell you. And make fixing mistakes part of your company's DNA. Celebrate getting better. Things go wrong. People make mistakes. But if you learn from those mistakes and don't make them again, then you can get better. And just like we did in looking at financial results over time, we like to create a dashboard of the critical measures of success for your business. And created a little dashboard here. This one had to do with a client of ours who is in the landscaping business. And over time, we tracked the number of active jobs they were working on and wanted that to grow. They wanted to know how well they were doing on estimating and actually getting jobs. So the upper right-hand graph was that. The blue line was how many jobs were estimated, and the red is how many were accepted. And they're trying to drive that higher, a higher ratio of acceptance. Customer satisfaction is absolutely critical in every business. So they measured how satisfied their customers were with the whole process of dealing with them. And then we threw a financial one in here, which was their monthly additions to their accounts receivable over 90 days. And in this case, see, it went up and down, but it was on average quite steady at about $40,000 a month of accounts receivable. That is money that should have been in their pocket, and without watching this and actually doing something about it, then they would continue to be funding their customers. So by watching things like this over time, you can not only take those standards, but turn them into things that will improve your business. And we'll finally turn to branding, which is the seventh deadly sin. People think about branding as the marketing, what the logo looks like, what the taglines are, but everything about your company is part of your branding. Customer's perception is always the most important aspect, whether it goes back to pricing, everything about it. Think like a customer, and then do your employees share your vision? They have to know what it is. You have to brand internally as well as externally. And then is your marketing accessible to your target customers? Are you using electronic media these days? Are you checking it to make sure that it's getting to the right audience? We dealt with a client in western Colorado who was in the modular home business, and they had a beautiful website. It was absolutely gorgeous with all the specifications and all the photos, but it was all done in a manner such that if a client came looking for them, it didn't have the meta tags that brought it up on the search engines, and it was buried so deeply that nobody could find it. So, who are the target customers? Who are those 80% of all potential customers who are going to bring you most of your business? And does your branding reach out to them? Does it help, or does it hurt your bottom line? Customer service is the big bugaboo for a lot of small businesses. Well, how are you positioned? There are really three ways that you can compete. You can be the lowest price, the best quality, or the best service. And you can be a combination of these, but nobody that I've ever heard of can compete in all three arenas at the same time. So pick one. If you're in the small goods business, you're probably not going to be lower priced than Walmart. So how else can you compete? Well, is the quality of your goods or is the quality of your service better? Do you have something unique to offer? That's what your brand should be. Hiring. Talk about that again. You have to hire people that will fit within your company's culture and represent your brand to your customers. And training your people is critical. In customer contact business, 20% of the way a client reacts comes from how friendly your people are. 40% is their knowledge of products and services, and an astounding 40% of the way customers perceive you is how you handle their complaints. You can be much better at solving problems and be very well received by customers. Handling unhappy customers is really important. This next little acronym comes out of the restaurant business. You want to sympathize with the customer who's got a problem. You want to take action. You want to vindicate that they really had an issue. And then in the restaurant business, the E, the eat in SAVE here, is give them something that wants to make them come back to your restaurant, whether it's a free dessert or a gift coupon to come back again. It's just a little acronym that says, we hear you, you were wrong, or you were wronged, we were wrong, we'll take care of it, and please come again. The customer is always right, except when he's not. And every one of us has had a customer at some point along the line who was more trouble than they're worth. And at the moment of interaction, they're right. But we can invite them not to come back. We don't want customers who are more trouble than they're worth. Same thing with an employee who doesn't fit and who doesn't match your branding. If they're not meeting your standards, whether it's in the way they treat customers, the way they dress, the quality of their work, get rid of them. It all affects your brand and how the rest of the world sees you. So, as we're wrapping this up, I say, now what? Well, it's consistency. It's consistency in putting your customer first. Build your branding to fit those customer expectations. Hire and train your people appropriately. Measure what's important, and it's both financial and non-financial. Financial results are a result of having done the right things to meet the customer's expectations. And adapt. The world is changing. Everything changes every day. You need to adapt to those changes or we're dead. So this is our presentation of the 7 deadly sins. Richard, do you want to throw anything else in here before we start picking up comments and questions?
Well, let's pick up some comments and questions, but I'd like to use examples and Disney is a real fine example. Many people have been to Disney World or Disneyland and seen the caliber of people they hire, all the way down to the janitorial people sweeping the streets. And they have a very strict rules in terms of how their employees are supposed to dress and act. And all the way down to things like no visible tattoos, no piercings. And they make that company policy, and they spell that out in the beginning. And by doing so, that sets the standards. And Disney has worked so hard over the years to set the standards of what they want their employees to be, and that's part of their brand. And we've all been there, and we all have a warm spot in our heart for Disneyland because of the cheeriness of the employees and how they look, and they fit the American dream. Well, that all starts with the hiring process. So that's just one example of understanding how your brand gets all the way down to your employees and part of your hiring process.
So I'll jump in here and, oh, sorry, go ahead. I was going to throw in some questions.
Okay. Go ahead.
So a couple things I think would probably be good to address that came up. One individual asked, what kind of adjustments will I need to make, kind of in regard to a budget? Should I like change the budget mid-year? And I think you kind of talked on it briefly about adjusting the budget in the middle, but if not, maybe give an additional couple of pointers on that.
Well, as I said, a budget is never right. It's only your best guess on the day that you make it. And the adjustments have to come in your operating characteristics. If you're finding out that something's not selling, you need to go in and understand why. Is it because it's not marketed properly? Is it because it's priced incorrectly? Is there a quality problem? Whatever it is, you have to make adjustments and adjust the operations so that things are working the way that you want them to. Do we change the budget? No. We leave the budget. It was our best guess. And when we next budget, and most people budget on an annual basis, when we do next year's budget, we take into account all the things that we learned this year, all the things that changed, and use them in creating next year's budget. It's a guideline. It's not a hard and fast, we absolutely have to meet everything that's in there because the world doesn't work that way. So it's guidelines. And the adjusting how we operate, the things that we do every day, is what's important.
So here we go, another one that we have coming in from Ken, who looks like he has submitted a question during the registration form regarding hiring an office assistant to kind of free up some of his time for other critical things. What do you think, speak a little bit kind of to the hiring process again regarding maybe how Ken could address this issue. So he's hoping, he's wondering if it's a good idea to hire somebody to fill that spot of kind of an office assistant so he can free up some of his time. Maybe he's used to kind of taking on those tasks right now and is not sure whether or not he can delegate the material. So maybe you can speak a little bit more to how to approach that kind of situation.
Well, let me speak to that, Todd, if I could, because I don't know exactly what industry Ken is involved in. If he's in the personal service business and he's selling time like one of the other participants was talking about earlier, well, his time is very valuable, and so if there are duties that he's doing that can be given to someone else and that he can use that time to sell more time, so to speak, well, that's a pretty easy evaluation. If he could delegate 3 or 4 hours a day to someone to do administrative tasks, and those 3 or 4 hours a day could use as billable hours, that's a pretty easy equation. The uneasy equation, and the one that many people have a hard time coming to grips with, is all of us. Every one of us has our strengths and weaknesses. and Ken very well could be doing things that he's not really good at. And the quicker we're able to recognize where our strengths and weaknesses lie, and maybe things like dealing with invoices or collecting accounts receivable is something that he doesn't really have the affinity for, he very well could have that office assistant come in and be a very valuable tool to him as well. So there's some easy calculations, like I say, if indeed Ken is in the business of selling time. Then there's others that are not quite as easy, but you have to come to grips with it and say, hey, what do I do good and what do I don't do very well, and let's give it to somebody that does it real well. I don't know if that helps Ken or not, but those are some observations.
Yeah, it's a little bit outside of this.
Go ahead.
Sorry. It's a little bit outside of the scope of these 7 deadly sins, but Richard hit right at the core of this is, where is your time best spent? What are you doing? What can you do that best advances the goals of the company? And if any one of those tasks that you're doing isn't the best use of your time, then how can you get that off of your plate and onto somebody else's? Hiring an office assistant may be a good way to do it. Outsourcing some of those tasks to somebody who specializes it in that could be another way of doing it. And there is no single answer to that, but there's a whole menu of opportunity, and that's the job of the entrepreneur, the owner, the founder, to not let themselves get trapped into the mundane stuff that has to be done, but is keeping him or her from doing what he really does best.
And it looks like too here that it probably partially plays into the allocation of a budget to do those things. So he definitely recognizes that the need is there, but kind of the cash flow factor or the fear factor being the kind of funds that he has to allocate to it. Any advice on that piece?
What we advise people to do and what we do ourselves is create a pro forma, create a budget of, all right, this is where I'm spending my time and my hours today. If I could get rid of tasks A, B, and C, I could do more of what's more valuable. And if I do that, it will bring in a given amount of revenue that I can use that to spend for the office assistant. So it's a calculation, but it's a guess. It's an educated guess based on where everything goes. And yes, Ken, you're exactly right. We need to watch cash flow. You can't spend money today on an office assistant on the if-come of, well, I'll be able to sell 18 more widgets in 6 months. Cash flow has to match where the revenues are coming from. So lay it out on a sheet of paper. See how it looks like it might work out, and then build that into your plans.
Good. It looks like says it makes sense to him. So
a couple of other just quick points that small businesses that we like to talk about is, and I'll use the example of the baker, the person that loved to bake, and so he or she decided to open a bakery. Well, as a baker, they're what we refer to as a technician. But when they started a bakery, they not only have to be the technician in the beginning, but they have to run the business. And running the business is a different set of skills than being a technician and knowing how to bake. And so our advice to a lot of people that are in that situation, if you really want to just bake, go to work for a bakery, because a bakery is a business that runs and does baking. But once you start a business, you have an obligation to the business, to the employees, to your customers, to your vendors, to make a profit, to reinvest. And so it's important that you understand you're no longer a technician. You have to be a manager and run the business. And by the way, you get to do some baking every now and then. Our other favorite expression is, when you start your own business, the joy is you get to pick which 80 hours a week you want to work. And that's very true in the beginning of all small businesses. But again, running the business is an extremely part of understanding businesses.
Well, it looks like we are pressing up against the top of the hour here, but we may have time for one additional question actually that again came in from Margie in the registration form. And if we want to touch on it quickly, and obviously we can do some direct follow-up afterwards, but she was wondering maybe a couple of best practices or important do's or don'ts for setting up a one-person LLC that's essentially a service-based business, doesn't have any employees or any products yet, but just kind of on the front end. What would maybe be some best practices that you would pass along to her?
Well, one of the things she just said, and she's already taken the right step, is to make sure you protect the liability aspect of your business. And she said LLC, which means someone helped her set up a business and created a limited liability company that limits the liability of the entity. So that's a big step, is having the proper vehicle in order to do business. Todd, what would you suggest as well?
Well, the other things follow from a lot of the 7 deadly sins. If you look at the opposite of those, set up proper accounting, set up your branding, establish controls and standards, then you know where you are. So you can look at these as good examples of what not to do. And we are here at Business ASAP, and you can contact us through our website and our blog, and we'll be happy to discuss this in more detail.
Great. Well, I appreciate you both taking some time out of your afternoon to join us today and spread some insight on the topic. And again, if there were questions that weren't addressed either here or in the registration form, both Richard and Todd will get a copy of those questions. They can follow up with you directly. Again, take advantage of some of the information that they have on their website there at businessasap.com. And in addition, in the post event email, either later this afternoon or first thing tomorrow, you receive the recording, as I mentioned before. So any type of review you'd like to do or listen to it again, and also a link to their Facebook page and some other information that they've provided. So keep an eye out for that as well. So on that note, again, thank you, gentlemen, for taking some time this afternoon. Thanks to the audience, too, for doing the same and joining us today on the webinar. And if you want to take a minute for the post-event survey and give us some of your feedback, we obviously both appreciate that as well. And I will pop that up on your screen at this time. Thanks again for joining the call. Have an awesome afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you back on another event in the ReadyTalk webinar series.